Are you all right? That was too close.
The cold doesn't bother me, but the tracker is still out there.
The mountain came down like the sky itself had broken. Kellen Ash didn't remember deciding to run. One moment he was checking his traps along the ridge. The next, the world was a wall of white thunder, and he was moving on instinct alone, throwing himself behind a jut of granite half a second before the avalanche swallowed the trail he'd been standing on. When the roar faded into a ringing silence, he lay still for a long moment, waiting to find out if he was alive. He was. Barely. That was when he heard the sound. Not wind, not settling snow. A voice, low, ragged, speaking words he didn't understand, in a rhythm that sounded less like speech and more like someone praying to something that wasn't listening. He followed it 50 yards downslope and found her half buried under a fallen pine, one leg pinned beneath the trunk at an angle. Legs weren't supposed to bend. Her skin was the color of dusk, gray-blue and faintly luminous along old scars that ran like riverbeds down her arms. Antlers, small and velvet dark, rose from her temples, one of them snapped clean at the base. A beastkin. A scout, judging by the black leather harness and the broken signal horn, still looped around her neck. An enemy. If you asked anyone in the valley below, Kellen had grown up on stories about what the beastkin did to trappers who wandered too far into the high passes. He'd buried a cousin because of one of those stories, or a story like it. Nobody was ever entirely sure the stories were true, only that they were useful. She looked up at him with eyes like burnt amber, and she did not beg. That was the thing he would remember later, when people asked him why. She looked at him the way you look at weather, something that was simply going to happen to you, one way or the other, and there was no use pretending otherwise. Finish it, she said, in the trade tongue, her accent thick as smoke. Or leave, either is faster than watching you decide. Kellen knelt down anyway and started clearing snow from around the trunk. Her name was Senator. It took him 3 days to learn that much, holed up in his line cabin with the fire built high, and her legs splinted as well as a trapper's rough knowledge of anatomy could manage. 3 days of watching her drift between fevered silence and a wariness so sharp it filled the whole small room like smoke of its own. On the 4th day, she finally slept without waking every hour to check the door. On the 5th, she asked him why. Kellen turned that question over for a while before he answered it, because it deserved an honest answer, and he didn't entirely have one. You'd have done the same for a dog caught in a trap, he said finally. Didn't seem like it should matter what kind of person you were. Sen was quiet a long time. Then she said, "Most humans think it matters very much what kind of person you are. Most humans," Kellen said, "haven't had to dig anybody out of a mountain." That earned him something that was almost a laugh, cut short by the pain in her ribs. It was the first sound she'd made that wasn't guarded. He learned, in pieces, what he probably shouldn't have wanted to know. That she'd been running a message south, from a beastkin settlement in the high valleys to another beyond the ridge, when the slope let go beneath her. That the message concerned a man named Aldrich Vane, who owned most of the trade routes through the pass and half the magistrates who were supposed to police them. That Vane had been buying up beastkin land through forged treaties and unpayable debts, and that 3 settlements had already been driven off ground their people had held for 200 years. That the message she'd been carrying, now lost somewhere under 40 feet of snow, was a warning. Vane's men were planning to burn the 4th settlement before the spring thaw made the roads defensible again. Sen had been trying to reach it in time. She hadn't. "How long," Kellen asked, "before they move?" "I don't know anymore," Sen said, staring into the fire with an expression that had nothing left in it but exhaustion. "I was supposed to know. That was the entire purpose of the run I failed." Kellen looked at her leg, splinted and useless for at least another 2 weeks by any honest reckoning, and he looked at the fire, and he thought about the cousin he'd buried on the strength of a story that might not even have been true, and he made a decision that he understood, even as he made it, would cost him everything he had. "Then I'll go instead," he said. Aldrich Vane's estate sat at the mouth of the valley like a toll gate made of stone, and Kellen Ash had never in his life had a reason to walk through its front doors. He had one now, a forged letter of introduction, hastily copied in Sen's careful hand from a genuine document she'd once intercepted, claiming Kellen as an independent surveyor interested in purchasing mountain parcels. It was a thin disguise. It would not survive close inspection. It didn't need to. It only needed to survive one evening. The estate was full of the kind of wealth that had learned to be quiet about itself. No gaudy displays, just good wool, good boots, good manners worn like armor. Vane received him in his study lined with maps, every beastkin settlement in the region marked in careful ink, several of them crossed through with a single decisive line. A surveyor, Vane said, studying Kellen the way a man studies a horse he isn't sure he wants to buy. Interested in the north parcels. Interested in knowing which parcels are actually for sale, Kellen said. I've heard some of the boundary lines up there are disputed. Something flickered behind Vane's eyes. Not alarm, not yet, but attention. The boundaries, he said, are being clarified. The old claims were never properly documented. A regrettable oversight of the original treaty, which my associates and I are simply correcting. And the settlement at Greyhorn Hollow? Is that boundary being clarified too? The room went very still. Vane set down his glass with exaggerated care. You're better informed than a surveyor needs to be. I get around, Kellen said. You get around, Vane repeated, and then he smiled, and it was the smile of a man who had already decided how the rest of the evening would go and was simply enjoying the last moment before he had to do anything about it. Sit down, Mr. Ash. Let's discuss what you actually came here to discuss. What Kellen actually came to discuss took considerably longer to say out loud than it had taken to plan in his head, and it went considerably worse. Vane's men had him disarmed within the minute. His forged letter burned in the study's own fireplace as a kind of pointed insult, and Kellen himself deposited in a windowless storeroom with his hands bound and a guard outside the door who looked entirely too pleased about his assignment. You should have stayed a trapper, Vane told him before he left. Greyhorn Hollow burns in 2 nights regardless of anything you do now. The only question that matters tonight is whether you burn with it or whether you're simply useful enough to keep breathing a while longer. I'd think carefully, if I were you, about which category you'd rather belong to. He left Kellen alone with that thought and the sound of the storeroom door locking. Kellen spent the first hour testing the ropes and learning nothing except that whoever tied them had done it professionally. He spent the second hour doing the math on 2 nights, 1 bad leg, and a woman alone in a lime cabin 11 miles up a mountain, and not liking any of the numbers he arrived at. He was still doing that math when the door opened without a sound, and the guard outside it folded to the floor without much more. Xen stood in the doorway on a leg that should not have been carrying her weight, her face gray with the effort of it. A stolen knife already working at the ropes on his wrists before he'd fully registered she was real. You walked 11 miles, Kellen said, on that leg. I crawled some of it, Xen said, without a trace of humor. Get up, we don't have until morning. They didn't make it out of the estate quietly. That had never really been the plan. Not once Kellen understood how thoroughly Vane's men outnumbered anything 2 people could manage alone. What they made instead was noise and confusion, and enough of a fire in the estate's own document room to make sure the maps marking every beastkin settlement for demolition went up in smoke along with the forged treaties that were supposed to justify it. If Vane wanted to burn Greyhorn Hollow on schedule, he was going to have to do it without his paperwork, without half his hired men, who scattered the moment the fire took hold. And Kellen made sure of this personally, with considerably more satisfaction than the situation strictly required, without the strongbox of falsified deeds he'd been using to bully 3 other settlements into signing away land that was never legally his to take. They rode double on a stolen horse into the last hour of darkness, and Sen sent up a signal flare over the ridge that Kellen didn't understand the meaning of, but that made her exhale. Finally, like something long held had come loose in her chest. Greyhorn Hollow will see it, she said. They'll be ready. They'll be gone from the burn site before Vane's men so much as saddle a horse. And Vane? Sen looked back down the valley, toward the orange glow still visible above the tree line, where the estate's document room continued to burn. Vane, she said, just lost every piece of paper he was using to steal my people's land. I imagine his next few months will be considerably less comfortable than he's used to. They didn't speak again until they reached the lime cabin, and the fire, and the particular quiet of two people who had gone out to stop something terrible and had, against every reasonable expectation, actually stopped it. Kellen built the fire back up while Sen eased herself down onto the cot, her leg clearly furious with her for the 11 miles she'd asked it to walk, and for a long time neither of them said anything at all. It was Sen who finally broke the silence, watching him from across the small room with an expression he hadn't seen on her before. Not wariness, not exhaustion. Something quieter than either. "You didn't have to come back for me," she said. "Not the first time on the mountain. And you certainly didn't have to walk into that man's house tonight." "No," Kellen agreed. "Didn't have to do either one." "Then why?" He thought about it the way he'd thought about it the first time she'd asked, turning the question over, looking for the honest answer instead of the easy one. "Because somewhere along the way," he said finally, "I stopped being able to tell the difference between your people and mine. And once that happens, you don't get to go back to only saving the ones that look like you." Sen studied him a long moment in the firelight, her burnt amber eyes steady on his. Then, for the second time since he'd pulled her out of the snow, she laughed, a real one this time, short and surprised out of her, like she hadn't expected to have it in her anymore. "That," she said, "is either the wisest thing you've said since I met you, or the most foolish. I haven't decided which." "Ask me again in spring," Kellen said, and outside the small cabin window, the first gray light of morning was already climbing over the ridge, indifferent and unhurried, the way mornings always were after a night that had nearly gone very differently, moving forward regardless, the way mountains do, the way debts finally paid always do, settling quietly into something that, for the first time in a long while, looked a great deal like peace.